Cinderella's Curse. Chapter 1. The Beginning of the Curse. Cinderella sat on the cold floor of her small room, enveloped in darkness and despair. Her days were filled with the cruelty of her stepmother and her stepsisters, Anastasia and Drizella. Every day seemed endless, full of humiliations and hard labor, with no escape in sight. Her body was exhausted, and her soul was slowly fading under the weight of hatred. Night had fallen over the old house, shrouding it in grim silence. In that moment, Cinderella felt the presence of something unusual. A faint glow began to fill her room, and she turned to see the source of the light. Before her stood a figure wrapped in a veil of darkness, with eyes burning with a cold, sinister light. "Do not be afraid, my child," it hissed, the voice both soothing and cold like a winter wind. "I know of your suffering. I see how they torment and humiliate you. But the time has come to put an end to this madness." Cinderella's heart pounded as she gazed at the strange woman. This was not the kind fairy godmother she had heard about in childhood tales. This was a witch, menacing and dangerous. But in her eyes flickered an understanding and a power that could free Cinderella from her bitter fate. "Who are you?" Cinderella asked in a trembling voice, her eyes never leaving the witch's figure. "My name is Lilith," the witch replied, her smile widening into a cruel grin. "I have come to offer you a chance to change your life. I will grant you power that will allow you to take revenge on those who have hurt you. But remember, my magic will last only until midnight. When the clock strikes 12, everything will return to its place, and you will have to face the consequences of your actions." Cinderella froze, considering the offer. Fear and hatred battled within her heart. It was tempting to finally feel strong, capable of standing up to her tormentors. But what would happen afterward? What would become of her when the time ran out? "Are you afraid you won't be able to control your desires?" Lilith continued, reading her thoughts. "But does it matter when you have the chance to take revenge?" Cinderella looked at her battered hands, remembering all the humiliations and tears. Her heart ached with pain, and she felt that pain transform into something dark and terrifying. She wanted to end this nightmare. She wanted her stepmother and sisters to feel even a fraction of the pain they had inflicted on her every day. "I accept," she whispered, raising her eyes to Lilith. The witch merely nodded, and in the next moment, Cinderella felt a wave of dark energy surge through her body. Her tattered and dirty dress began to transform into an exquisite black gown with crimson patterns reflecting her inner pain and anger. Her skin glowed, her hair shone with a dark luster. She was no longer the weak, frightened girl. Now she was a force to be reckoned with. "You are ready now," the witch said, her voice echoing like distant thunder. "Go and show them who you really are." With those words, Lilith vanished, leaving Cinderella alone with her newfound power and dark thoughts. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she knew there was no turning back. The night promised to be long and full of ominous surprises. Cinderella, shrouded in darkness and empowered by new strength, slowly rose from the floor and headed for the door. She was no longer a victim. Now her fate was in her own hands, and she was ready to face it, no matter how terrifying it might be. Chapter 2. The Ball and the Revenge. Night had descended upon the castle as Cinderella, now transformed by Lilith's magic, appeared on the steps of the royal palace. Her black gown shimmered in the moonlight, reflecting the darkness that had taken root in her soul. As she entered the grand gates, she felt a cold wind, as if it were a premonition of the events that were about to unfold. Inside the castle, there was merriment, music, laughter, and conversation, all creating the illusion of peace and happiness. But Cinderella saw through this facade to the true nature of each guest. Her eyes, now empowered by dark magic, could discern the lies, hypocrisy, and malice hidden behind their bright smiles. When she entered the ballroom, all eyes turned to her. No one recognized her, but no one could look away from her figure. The prince, standing at the center of the room, felt something strange when his gaze met hers. In her eyes burned a fire that made his heart race faster. But within that fire was something dark that both frightened and intrigued him. Cinderella, exuding an invisible power, approached the prince. Her steps were graceful, but each one carried a hidden threat. The people parted before her, as if sensing that she was not just a beautiful lady, but something far more sinister. "You are enchanting, madam," the prince said as she drew closer. His voice was full of admiration, but deep down he felt an inexplicable unease. "Thank you, Your Highness," Cinderella replied, her voice sweet, yet there was a strange, almost hypnotic melody within it. "Perhaps tonight you will see a different side of me." The prince offered her his hand, and they began to dance. But this was no ordinary dance. It was like a game of cat and mouse, where the prince had yet to realize that he was the prey. Cinderella twirled him around the room, as if ensnaring him in her web, her movements light yet imbued with an inexorable force. At some point, her gaze fell upon her stepmother and stepsisters, who stood on the sidelines watching the ball. Their eyes glittered with envy and hatred as they saw the prince dance with the mysterious stranger. But they could not recognize in this enigmatic woman the servant girl they had tormented. The stepmother merely smirked, deciding that this was just another rival for her daughters. Cinderella felt the anger boil within her. Lilith's magic amplified her emotions, making them almost unbearable. She remembered every humiliation, every blow, every insult she had endured, and now she could take her revenge. When the music ended, the prince, still mesmerized, tried to say something, but Cinderella whispered softly to him, "Forgive me, Your Highness, but I have something to attend to." She curtsied and quickly made her way toward her stepmother and stepsisters, leaving the prince in bewilderment. As she approached them, she stopped a few steps away, and a cunning smile spread across her face. "How dare you come here and disturb us?" Drizella exclaimed, recognizing a threat to her ambitions in this woman. "You don't know who I am, and you don't understand what you're playing with." Cinderella replied coldly, her voice filled with dark magic that made her stepmother and stepsisters tremble. She raised her hand, and the air around her began to vibrate with tension. The guests of the ballroom started to feel it, their laughter and conversation fading. All eyes turned to Cinderella and her family. People began to sense something was terribly wrong, as though the very atmosphere had filled with a sinister force. "You always thought of me as nothing, a toy to be controlled," she continued, her voice growing louder and more terrifying. "But now, it's time to pay for everything." With a swift motion of her hand, her stepmother and stepsisters felt an invisible force begin to choke them. The guests watched in horror as Anastasia and Drizella, coughing and gasping for air, fell to their knees, Their faces turned blue, their eyes bulging in terror and pain. But suddenly, the clock in the hall began to chime midnight. The first chime was like thunder in a clear sky. Cinderella's magic began to wane, her power slipping away, and she felt the darkness leaving her, replaced by emptiness and fear. On the final stroke of midnight, the stepmother and her daughters, still alive, struggled to rise from the floor. The guests, frozen in shock, began to regain their senses. The prince, finally breaking free from the spell that had held him, rushed toward Cinderella. Cinderella, realizing that her magic had disappeared, turned to the prince, her eyes filled with horror and tears. Now she was just an ordinary girl, deceived and used by a wicked witch. "No, don't look at me," she whispered, trying to flee. But the prince caught her by the hand. "What happened to you?" he asked, not understanding whether he was seeing the mysterious woman or the tormented servant girl. But Cinderella couldn't answer. All she knew was that Lilith's curse had brought terrifying consequences, and now she had to pay for her vengeful desires. Chapter 3: The Midnight Chime. A heavy silence hung over the ballroom. The echo of the 12th chime of the clock still reverberated through the castle, like the rumble of thunder before a storm. Cinderella, standing in the center of the room in her black gown, suddenly felt the power granted by Lilith leaving her body. She abruptly let go of the prince's hand and staggered backward. His eyes were full of confusion and dismay. Cinderella glanced around the hall. Her stepmother and stepsisters were still on their knees, their faces twisted with pain and fear. But now she saw them not as enemies, but as victims she herself had created. The horror of what she had done filled her soul. "What have you done?" the prince whispered, taking a step back. His eyes, once full of admiration, now reflected disgust and fear. In the dim light of the candles, her features, once beautiful and mysterious, now resembled a mask hiding a dark, wounded soul. Cinderella, trembling with fear and sorrow, took a step back, then another. Her body, once enveloped in magic, now felt foreign to her. The gown began to tear and disintegrate before her eyes, reverting to the rags she had worn for the past several years. She couldn't stay here another second. With horror in her heart, she turned and ran, stumbling and nearly falling as she descended the grand staircase of the castle. The final chimes of the clock still echoed in her ears, marking each step closer to the unknown, yet inevitable, reckoning. The guests in the ballroom, frozen in shock, remained silent, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Only her stepmother and stepsisters, still barely alive, watched Cinderella flee with a mix of hatred and terror. Their gloating and arrogance had vanished, leaving only deep fear. The prince stood motionless, his thoughts spinning wildly. He had seen two completely different girls before him. One, the mysterious, beautiful woman unlike any he had ever met. And the other, a miserable, frightened servant girl who had transformed before his eyes. What was real? What curse had befallen her and the entire castle? Meanwhile, Cinderella burst out into the courtyard, her heart pounding, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She stopped at the fountain, breathing heavily and trying to understand what had happened to her. Her strength was failing her, and inside, a sense of hopelessness and guilt grew. But her ordeal was far from over. The water in the fountain, once crystal clear, suddenly began to bubble and darken. Cinderella stepped back in fear, but the darkness in the water continued to thicken until a figure cloaked in shadow rose from the depths of the fountain. It was Lilith. her eyes glowing like two hellish stars. "Did you think it would be that easy to rid yourself of what I gave you?" Lilith said mockingly, her voice sounding like an echo from the abyss. "You used my power, and now you must pay for it." Cinderella shook her head, her hands trembling with fear. I didn't know," she stammered, her voice barely audible. "Ignorance does not absolve you of responsibility, my child," Lilith replied coldly, stepping closer. "You wanted power, and you got it. You wanted revenge, and it was granted to you. But every magic comes at a price, and you will pay it." Cinderella lowered her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. She realized that her anger and thirst for revenge, which she had felt, had been used to create the horror she now faced. Lilith smiled, watching her suffer. "But do not fear," Lilith continued, her voice becoming softer, yet no less dangerous. "I can offer you another deal. You can stay with me, learn to control your power, and then no one will ever dare harm you." Cinderella looked up at Lilith. Hope mingled with fear in her eyes. She understood that this offer meant forever binding her fate to the darkness she so desperately wanted to escape. "Or," Lilith continued, her voice growing more venomous, "you can return to your old life, without power, without protection, and once again become the same Cinderella who was humiliated and despised. What will you choose?" Cinderella stood still, torn between the fear of the future and the desire to end the horror she had created. Her thoughts raced, and she could not make a decision. "Time is running out, my child," Lilith whispered, her voice fading as if from a distance. "Make your choice." Everything around them stood still. The darkness enveloped Cinderella, making her heart freeze in anticipation as she struggled to make the choice that would determine her fate. Chapter 4. The Price of the Curse. The darkness around Cinderella deepened. Her heart pounded as it was torn between fear and despair. Inside her, an internal struggle raged to remain under the power of the darkness that promised her strength or return to the life from which she had once so desperately sought to escape. Lilith stood nearby, her eyes glowing with malice and a sinister certainty that she had already won. She knew that faced with such a grim prospect, no soul could resist. Cinderella stood on the edge of a precipice, and only she could take the step in one direction or the other. Cinderella whispered, trying to find the words. Her voice trembled, but she tried to focus. Her thoughts, like in a whirlpool, swirled around, considering each option. She remembered how her stepmother and stepsisters forced her to work, how every day she felt powerless and alone. She remembered the humiliations, the insults, her longing for freedom. But with that came memories of what she had done under the influence of Lilith's magic. The pain, the fear, the destruction, all of it had become a part of her very being. Suddenly, she realized that true strength did not lie in revenge or magic, but in the ability to resist evil without succumbing to it. She, a simple girl, had to find within herself the strength to return to her true self, no matter how difficult it might be. "No," Cinderella said firmly, though her voice still shook. "I will not accept your offer." Lilith narrowed her eyes, her smile fading into irritation. "You pathetic girl do not understand what you are rejecting," she hissed coldly, her eyes flashing with fury. "Without my power, you will become nothing again. No one will come to your aid. You will suffer again as you did before, and all because you refused what I gave you." But Cinderella had already made her decision. She stood tall, her gaze resolute. "So be it," she said. "I am ready to return to my life, but I will not let the darkness consume my soul. It is better to be weak and remain myself than to lose my humanity for the sake of false power." Lilith roared with rage. Her figure began to blur into a dark vortex. Cinderella felt the magical current swirl around her, trying to engulf her, to tear her apart. But she stood firm, clenching her fists and planting her feet firmly on the ground. "You will regret this," Lilith cried, her voice full of spite and desperation. "I will leave you to live with the consequences of your actions. You will never forget what you have done. This will be your punishment." And with those words, the witch disappeared, leaving Cinderella alone in the empty castle courtyard. The wind died down, the darkness dissipated, and only silence filled the space around her. Cinderella slowly sank to the ground, her strength leaving her, her body trembling from the ordeal. But inside her was a sense that she had made the right choice. Now she would have to face the consequences of her actions, the realization of what she had done under the influence of Lilith's dark magic. This was her cross, her punishment, but also her liberation. She knew that her life would never be the same, that pain and suffering would accompany her until the end. But she also knew she could survive it, for deep down she remained herself, the same Cinderella who, despite all adversity, kept her heart pure. At that moment, the prince finally found her. His face was full of concern and regret. He saw her in this state, weak, vulnerable, but at the same time incredibly strong in spirit. "Cinderella," he called softly, approaching her. "What happened to you? I don't understand everything, but I'm here, and I want to help you." Cinderella raised her eyes to him, and in them shone weariness mixed with bitterness and quiet joy, that despite everything, he had not turned away from her. "I am not who you thought I was," she whispered, lowering her gaze. "I have done terrible things, and I must answer for them, but I am no longer afraid." The prince slowly knelt beside her, taking her hand. He didn't know all the details, but he saw before him a girl who had gone through hell and emerged different, but still true. And at that moment, he realized that, despite everything that had happened, he could not leave her alone. "We will get through this," he said confidently, holding her hand tightly. "I will be by your side." And for the first time in a long time, Cinderella felt that she truly would not have to face everything alone. She had made her choice, and now she would have to walk the path she had chosen. But on this path, she was no longer alone. Chapter 5. A finale with a taste of horror. Morning brought anxiety and chaos to the kingdom. News of the strange events at the ball spread throughout the castle and beyond, fueling fear and curiosity among the subjects. No one knew exactly what had happened, but rumors multiplied with each passing hour, coloring the incident in dark and eerie tones. The prince, having neglected his royal duties, was wholly absorbed in caring for Cinderella, who had spent the night in deep internal turmoil. She knew that her magical actions had left scars not only on her soul, but on the entire kingdom. Her stepmother and stepsisters, though they had survived, were now forever changed. Their eyes, full of fear and hatred, reflected all they had endured, and this gave Cinderella no peace. Meanwhile, strange occurrences began to happen in the castle. It seemed that Lilith's shadow had not vanished but only retreated, lurking in the dark corners of the palace. Servants whispered of ghosts, strange noises, and unexplained disappearances. The night that had shrouded the castle after the ball had left its mark, and that mark was deeper than anyone could have imagined. The prince, realizing the seriousness of the situation, made a decision. He gathered his advisors and the kingdom's best sorcerers to uncover what had transpired. They needed to find a way to cleanse the castle of dark magic, to free it from the curse that Cinderella had brought with her. But the deeper they tried to penetrate the essence of what had happened, the more it became apparent that the darkness had taken root more deeply than anyone had expected. The sorcerers felt an unseen presence that emanated from the very depths of the castle, filling them with horror and paralyzing fear. During this time, Cinderella, realizing that her past actions continued to cause destruction all around her, decided that she could not simply sit and wait for someone else to solve the problem. She was determined to correct what she had done, even if it required all the strength she had left. The prince, seeing her resolve, offered to accompany her in the search for the source of the darkness. Together, they ventured into the ancient catacombs beneath the castle, where, according to legend, the very heart of the curse lay hidden. The catacombs greeted them with an eerie silence and cold that sent shivers down their spines. The walls, covered in ancient symbols and mysterious inscriptions, seemed to whisper in a forgotten language, warning them of what lay ahead. Cinderella and the prince moved forward, holding torches that barely dispelled the darkness around them. With each step, the pressure and tension grew, and soon they found themselves standing before massive doors adorned with ominous symbols. These doors were the final barrier to the heart of the darkness. "We must open them," Cinderella said quietly, feeling her fear transform into determination. "Only then can we free the castle and everyone who lives in it." The prince nodded, his face serious, but his eyes held confidence. Together, they exerted their strength to push the doors open. With a dull thud, the doors slowly creaked open, releasing a stream of icy air that seemed to come from the very depths of the underworld. Beyond the doors was a vast chamber, illuminated by a sinister crimson light. In the center of the room stood an ancient altar, surrounded by statues of dark beings, each one appearing alive and watching them. On the altar lay a mysterious artifact, a dagger of ancient origin, pulsating with dark energy. "This is the source," Cinderella whispered, feeling Lilith's power returning, but this time with doubled intensity. "We must destroy it," the prince said firmly, though his voice trembled with hidden terror. Cinderella approached the altar, her hands trembling as she reached for the dagger. At that moment, Lilith's shadow appeared before her, her eyes blazing with fury and malice. "You will never be free of me," she snarled, her voice echoing through the chamber. "This dagger is your destiny. Embrace it, and you will become like me. Refuse, and you will destroy everything you hold dear." Cinderella froze, her fingers gripping the hilt of the dagger. The darkness that had once enveloped her returned, as if inviting her into its embrace, from which there could be no escape. But in that moment, she remembered the prince, his care and support, his belief in her. She remembered that there was not only darkness in life, but also light, and that the choice between them always remained with the person. With an effort that took all her strength, Cinderella raised the dagger and plunged it into the heart of the altar. At that instant, Lilith's shadow lunged at her, but it was too late. With a resounding crack, the dagger pierced the stone, and the entire chamber shook with a powerful explosion of light and energy. The darkness surrounding them began to dissipate. The walls of the catacombs started to crumble, and Lilith's figure screamed as she dissolved into thin air. Her malevolent laughter turned into a desperate cry that faded away along with the last remnants of the curse. Cinderella, exhausted, collapsed to her knees, but the prince caught her, preventing her from falling. "We did it," he whispered, holding her close in his arms. The catacombs began to collapse, and they had to flee, leaving behind the crumbling walls and vanishing darkness. When they finally emerged outside, the first light of dawn greeted them with warmth and hope. The castle, now cleansed of the curse, once again shone in the rays of the morning sun. Cinderella and the prince stood atop the hill, gazing at the liberated kingdom. The darkness had been defeated, but the path to that victory had been long and treacherous. Cinderella knew she would never forget the lessons she had learned from her struggle, but now she could look to the future with hope. And though her heart still bore the traces of pain and sorrow, she knew she would always have the strength to resist any darkness that might befall her life. The end. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel and don't forget to hit the like button. Thank you for your attention.